This is a preview video of textbook assignment number 2, chapter 3, period 2, pages 89 to 109. So it begins with the Restoration Colonies. Now, the Restoration Colonies were proprietorships that were given by King Charles II, and they were given as a reward to those that supported the Stuart Restoration, hence the name, the Restoration Colonies. The Carolinas, which eventually became North Carolina and South Carolina. Characteristics of the Carolinas: there was a strict racial hierarchy. Eventually, there would be more enslaved people living in the Carolinas than free white people. Rice during this time period was the Carolina cash crop, very profitable. Again, this was before cotton. So in the Carolinas, rice was of the utmost importance in terms of cash crops. Pennsylvania, very different, was also called the Holy Experiment, founded by William Penn. He was a Quaker, and much of the characteristics of the colony took on Quaker ideologies. Quakers were pacifists. They did not believe in war. They treated Native Americans relatively well compared to their other English counterparts. They favored religious freedom. Not only the Quaker faith, but other faiths were allowed. So it became sort of a haven for those of differing religions. They did not believe in predestination like the Puritans. They favored more freedom for women, and some women were able to hold pastor types of roles in the Quaker religion. So Pennsylvania was unique and diverse and the most accepting of the 13 colonies. The Navigation Acts were a bunch of laws during this time period which protected the British interests in the colonies. So when stuff was shipped from the colonies, they could only trade with Britain, and they had to be carried on English ships. Also during this time period, the British, like many other empires, they favored an economic philosophy called mercantilism, where the colonies only existed to favor the motherland. Now, the colonists also very often engaged in smuggling to avoid these navigation acts and this mercantilism principle. Dominion of New England was set up in 1686 by King James II, and he appointed Governor Sir Edmund Andros. Now, the idea was so that the British Empire could gain more control over the New England region. Now, Sir Edmund Andros was very disliked by the colonists. During this time period also, the Glorious Revolution in 1688 in England took place. King James II was overthrown. William and Mary became joint rulers of England. Also, a constitutional monarch was installed, so no longer did the monarch have absolute power. Parliament also had power. This Glorious Revolution, the significance to the American colonies, it began to inspire revolutionary sentiments against the British Crown. During this time period, tribalization referred to the idea that Native American groups allied themselves with each other that before had not been allies in an attempt to become more powerful in the negotiations with the British and the French colonists. So they decided to team up with shared interests in the hopes that they would be able to barter better deals with the colonists. The South Atlantic system was the name given to the trade between the Caribbean, Brazil, and Africa. Now, this is an oversimplification of a very complex trade system, but some of the key components of this: sugar in the Caribbean was king. It was very lucrative. It was very labor intensive. Many slaves were needed in order to handle all of the labor. As mentioned earlier, in many of the Caribbean islands, there was a much larger slave population than there was a free white population. As a matter of fact, sugar was so profitable that in many cases they would import other crops simply because the land was so valuable for sugar. And the colonists and the British became very, very rich off of sugar. Slavery was especially harsh in the Caribbean, in the heat and the hard conditions that it took in getting sugar to market. The Middle Passage was that horrible, completely inhumane process where slaves were brought from Africa over to the Americas. The big takeaway from the South Atlantic system was that it was all very profitable for the British. And of course, it came on the back of very cruel and inhumane conditions for slaves. Slavery in the Chesapeake and the Carolinas. In this chapter, you'll learn how there were different lifestyles and conditions and labor that slaves took part in. One of the things that happened in these areas was a unique slave culture formed, combining their African culture and heritage and American culture. So there began to develop a slave or African American culture during this time period. Resistance during this time period really did not happen in the form of rebellions or violent rebellions on a very large scale. Resistance took place mostly in the form of working slowly, faking illnesses, breaking tools, and running away. The Stono Rebellion took place in 1739. This was a violent uprising in South Carolina on the Stono River, not super far from Charleston, South Carolina. Slave killed whites, and they tried to flee to Spanish Florida, where they were promised freedom from the Spanish government. Because of this rebellion, very strict slave laws were passed. Another thing that the Stono Rebellion did was it sort of changed the complexion of slavery in the colonies. Now there was a large fear that violent slave uprisings would happen, and there were severe laws restricting slave behavior that were instituted following the Stono Rebellion. So the Stono Rebellion certainly had a great change for the worse on slavery in the colonies. Salutary neglect is a concept that you certainly want to be familiar with from philosopher Edmund Burke. This was the idea that the British let the colonies alone as long as they were profitable. So as long as they were turning a profit for the motherland, they were able to exist in many ways with self-rule, with very little oversight from the motherland, as long as they were profitable. This, of course, ends in 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War, where the British say that the colonists must pay for the war, which essentially ends salutary neglect, and the British tightens its grip on the colonists, which of course then pushes towards the American Revolution because of the discontent of this from the colonists towards the British. So certainly salutary neglect, an idea that you want to be familiar with.